Some partners age into the firm, David. Others age out of it. That was the sentence Marcus Kellerman used right before the managing committee voted me out. Friday, 5:17 p.m. I remember the exact time because the sun was cutting through the west-facing windows of the boardroom in a way that made the mahogany table look almost orange. And I kept staring at that light because it was easier than looking at the 7 faces around me. 20 years earlier, I had been the second attorney Marcus hired when he opened Kellerman and Associates out of a rented office above a dry cleaner in downtown Hartford. Now I was sitting across from him, while he read a prepared statement about strategic realignment. The room was quiet in that specific way conference rooms get when everyone has already made up their minds, and they're just waiting for the ceremony to end. My name is David Prescott. I guess I should say that now. 51 years old, senior partner at Kellerman, Prescott and Vale, a mid-market M&A boutique specializing in mid-cap technology acquisitions across the Northeast. Or at least I was. 2 decades of building that firm, and apparently I was about to be walked out of it before the sun finished setting. Marcus folded his reading glasses carefully and set them on top of the folder in front of him. The committee has voted to accelerate your transition to of council status effective at the end of the month. Transition. That word always meant the opposite of what it sounded like. I remember staring at him because 8 years earlier, I had personally rebuilt his entire pitch strategy after he lost the Halberstam Industries deal to a firm out of Boston. Back then, he thanked me in front of the whole partnership. Now, he was speaking to me like I was a line item on a balance sheet that needed adjusting. Alina Vale slid a memorandum across the table without looking up. Alina, 38 years old, made partner 3 years ago after I sponsored her nomination personally. She had specifically requested I mentor her through her first 3 closings. Now her signature was on the second page of the document ending my equity stake. I actually laughed once under my breath because it sounded absurd. You're pushing me out the same week we're supposed to close the Meridian deal. Marcus gave that small controlled nod senior partners practice for exactly these moments. The transition will be seamless. That line always means someone hasn't thought it through. I asked what happened to the Trentwood pitch scheduled for Monday. Marcus said Alina and her team would be handling client continuity going forward. Alina, whose largest solo lead closing had been a $14 million transaction. Trentwood was $92 million with 3 overlapping regulatory jurisdictions and a family trust structure that required exactly the kind of relationship banking I had spent 12 years cultivating. But Alina spoke well in pitch meetings. She wore better suits than I did, and she golfed with 2 of the junior committee members. That mattered more than knowing where the operational landmines were buried. I looked down at the memorandum but barely read it. My mind had already gone somewhere else. My daughter Claire's senior year at Northwestern, the renovation loan on the house in West Hartford, the retirement projections my wife Corinne and I had built around distributions that were about to become severance. Marcus kept talking in that measured tone he used with clients who had just received bad diligence findings. The firm is grateful for your years of service. Grateful. That word did more damage than the vote itself, because I knew what it really meant. Too methodical, too cautious, too expensive, too willing to say no to deals the younger partners wanted to say yes to. Then Alina finally spoke, and what she said next made every muscle in my back tighten at once. David, we've already notified the active client list about the leadership restructuring. Alina said it the way people say things they've rehearsed in the mirror. Calm, measured, slightly too polished to be spontaneous. I sat perfectly still because I needed a second to process what she had just admitted. The clients had been told before I had, meaning the vote hadn't happened tonight. It had happened days ago, maybe weeks. This meeting wasn't a decision. It was a formality. A closing ceremony for something that had already been buried in quiet emails and hallway conversations I wasn't invited to. I looked at Marcus. He didn't look back. That silence told me everything the memorandum wouldn't. 20 years of pulling him out of professional fires, and he couldn't manage eye contact for 90 seconds. I finally spoke, and I made sure my voice stayed level because I had learned a long time ago that anger in a boardroom is a gift you hand your opponents. Who signed the notifications? Alina hesitated. Marcus answered instead. The managing committee sent a joint communication under firm letterhead. Joint communication. Corporate language for we didn't want any single person's name attached to it in case things went sideways. I asked which clients had received the notice. Marcus glanced at Alina. Alina glanced at the memorandum. Nobody wanted to answer that question, which told me they had sent it to everyone. Every active file, every retainer client, every prospective engagement in the pipeline, including Trentwood, including Meridian, including 3 long-standing relationships where I was the only person at the firm who had ever met the general counsel in person. My chest tightened, but I kept my expression neutral. Because I had just realized something none of them had thought through. They had told my clients I was leaving before they had figured out whether my clients would stay. I closed the memorandum slowly and slid it back across the table. I'll need until Monday to review this with my own counsel. Marcus's jaw moved slightly. He hadn't expected that phrase. Neither had Alina. In 20 years, I had never once brought outside representation into an internal firm matter. I had been the person other partners called when they needed calm advice during their own conflicts. Now I was the one requiring formal review, and everyone in that room understood what that shift meant. Marcus recovered quickly. Of course, we want this to be handled professionally. Professionally. That word had done a lot of work in this meeting. I stood up. Nobody stood with me. That detail stayed with me longer than anything else that happened in the boardroom. 20 years of walking into rooms where people rose to acknowledge me, and now 7 partners sat frozen in their chairs while I gathered my folder and my pen. I walked out without saying goodbye because there was nothing left to say that wouldn't sound smaller than the silence itself. The hallway outside felt strange. Familiar carpet, familiar lighting, familiar prints on the walls that I had personally approved during our expansion in 2019. But everything felt slightly displaced, like walking through a photograph of a place I used to live. I passed 2 junior associates near the elevator. Both of them looked down at their phones the moment they saw me. Not rudeness, something worse. Awareness. They already knew, which meant the firm hadn't just told clients before telling me. They had told the staff too. I rode the elevator down alone, and somewhere between the 14th floor and the lobby, my phone buzzed inside my jacket pocket. A text from a number I recognized immediately. Harrison Trent, principal shareholder of Trentwood Holdings. 6 words. David, call me when you're free. I stared at the screen for a long moment. Then I understood exactly what was about to happen next. And I finally allowed myself a small, quiet exhale, because Harrison Trent was not the kind of man who accepted transitions quietly. The parking garage was mostly empty by the time I reached my car. Friday evening at a downtown law firm empties out fast when the associates realize the partners have gone home. I sat in the driver's seat for almost 10 minutes without starting the engine, just holding the steering wheel and looking at nothing in particular through the windshield. The concrete pillar in front of me had a small scuff near the base where I had once tapped it with my bumper during a rainstorm about 12 years ago. I remembered laughing about it with Marcus the next morning. He had told the story at 3 different partnership dinners after that. Now I couldn't remember the last time we had actually spoken about anything that wasn't a client matter. I finally called Harrison back from the car. He answered on the second ring. David. His voice had that particular flatness successful men use when they're already angry but haven't decided who to be angry at yet. Harrison, I appreciate you reaching out directly. A pause. Then he said something that told me exactly how the next 72 hours were going to unfold. I received an email today from someone named Alina Vale explaining that she would be my new lead counsel effective Monday morning. I closed my eyes briefly. Yes, I was informed of the transition this afternoon. Harrison was quiet for a moment. Then he asked the question I had been waiting for. David, is this your decision or theirs? I had prepared for that question during the drive down from the 14th floor, because how I answered it would determine whether I walked out of Kellerman with my reputation intact or with everyone assuming I had been quietly incompetent for years. I gave him the answer I had rehearsed. Harrison, I can't discuss internal firm matters, but I can tell you that whatever you decide about Trentwood's representation should be based entirely on what serves Trentwood best. A long silence. Then Harrison said, "That's the answer of a man who was pushed." I didn't respond. I didn't need to. He continued, "I've worked with you for 12 years, David. I know what you sound like when you're choosing your words carefully. I want you at that closing table Monday, not some junior partner I've never met." I told him I would need to speak with my counsel before agreeing to anything. He said he would wait. Then he asked one more question that made the entire situation shift under me. "David, how many other clients received that email?" I told him I didn't know. That was the truth. Harrison exhaled once through his nose, a short, controlled sound. "I'll find out." He hung up before I could respond. I sat in the car for another minute, then finally started the engine. On the drive home, my phone buzzed 4 more times. I didn't check it until I pulled into my driveway. 3 voicemails, 1 text. The text was from Robert Halberstam, same firm I had rebuilt Marcus's pitch strategy for 8 years ago. 2 words: "Call tonight." Robert was 73 years old and had never in his life sent me a text that short. Something was already moving. Karen was in the kitchen when I walked in. She took one look at my face and set down the wine glass she was holding. "What happened?" I told her. Not the polished version, the real one. The vote, the memorandum, the clients being notified before I was, Alina's signature on the second page, Marcus not meeting my eyes. Karen listened without interrupting. When I finished, she didn't say anything for almost 30 seconds. Then she said something I wasn't expecting. "David, you built that firm. Every crisis they survived, you were in the room." I nodded slowly. She kept going. "So why are you the one who has to leave?" I didn't have an answer, but I was starting to understand something important. I called Robert Halberstam back at 9:14 that night. He answered before the first ring finished, which told me he had been holding the phone in his hand. "David." His voice sounded exactly the way it had sounded 8 years ago when we sat across from each other in a hotel restaurant in Boston, reviewing the pitch materials that eventually won his family business back from a competitor. "Robert, thank you for reaching out." He didn't waste time. "I received a communication from your firm this afternoon informing me that Alina Vale would be assuming primary responsibility for the Halberstam Industries relationship." I let him continue. "David, I've been doing business with attorneys for 51 years. I know exactly what that kind of email means." I stayed quiet. Robert had earned the right to reach his own conclusion without me guiding him toward it. Then he said something that made me sit down at my kitchen table. "David, I've already called 4 other people who received similar emails today." My stomach tightened, but I kept my voice steady. "Who?" He listed them slowly, letting each name land. Harrison Trent at Trentwood, Margaret Yun at Coastal Fabrication, the Bellamy family office. 2 of the regional bank general counsels I had spent years developing relationships with. All of them had received the same notification. All of them had contacted Robert independently within the same 6-hour window. That detail told me something Marcus and Alina had completely failed to understand. My clients weren't just clients. They were a network. And the moment the firm sent out that mass notification, that network had activated on its own. Robert continued, "We're having a conference call tomorrow morning at 10, all of us. I want you on that call." I told him I couldn't. Not until I had spoken with my own counsel about the terms of my transition and any restrictions on client contact during the separation period. Robert made a sound that was almost a laugh. "David, you're being professional about a situation where the people on the other side stopped being professional the moment they sent that email." I told him I understood, but that my professionalism was exactly what had made these relationships possible in the first place, and I wasn't going to abandon it now just because the firm had. Robert was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "That answer is why we're having this call in the morning. Get your counsel, do it fast." I hung up and sat at the kitchen table for a long time. Karen brought me a glass of water without saying anything. She understood what was happening. She had been married to me for 23 years, and she had watched me build my practice one relationship at a time. She knew what those relationships were worth. and she also knew that Kellerman and Associates had just made a mistake they didn't yet understand. At 10:22 p.m., I called Daniel Ostrov. Daniel and I had gone through law school together at Cornell. He had built his own practice in Boston specializing in partnership disputes and equity separations. I hadn't spoken to him in 11 months. He picked up on the third ring. "David, it's late." I told him what had happened, all of it. The vote, the memorandum, the mass client notification, Harrison's call, Robert's call, the conference meeting Saturday morning. Daniel was quiet for almost 40 seconds. Then he said something I hadn't expected. "David, they've handed you significant leverage without realizing it." I asked him to explain. He laughed once, dryly. "By notifying your clients before finalizing your separation terms, they've created an ambiguity around who actually holds those relationships during the transition period. Depending on your partnership agreement, that ambiguity could be worth a substantial amount of money." I told him I hadn't been thinking about money. Daniel said, "David, I know you haven't. That's why you need me to." We agreed to meet Saturday morning at 8:00 a.m. before Robert's conference call, and I finally allowed myself to believe something might actually shift. Daniel drove down from Boston overnight. He arrived at my house at 7:47 a.m. Saturday carrying a leather portfolio and a thermos of coffee he had made at some gas station on I-84. He looked exactly the same as he had in law school, just with more gray in his beard and better shoes. Karen let him in and pointed toward the dining room where I had already spread the memorandum, the partnership agreement, and every relevant firm document I could find in my home office across the table. Daniel sat down without small talk and started reading. He read for 40 minutes without speaking. I sat across from him, refilling his coffee twice. Karen brought toast at one point. Daniel didn't touch it. When he finally looked up, his expression had changed. "David, tell me again exactly how they communicated the vote to the client list." I walked him through it. The email had gone out under firm letterhead, signed by the managing committee collectively, describing my transition to of counsel status and introducing Alina Vale as the incoming lead partner for ongoing engagements. Daniel asked what time the email had been sent. I checked with Robert's forwarded copy. 3:42 p.m. Friday. My meeting with the committee had started at 5:00 p.m. Daniel set down his pen and looked at me across the table. "David, they notified your clients 78 minutes before they notified you." I already knew that, but hearing him say it out loud made something crystallize inside my chest. Daniel flipped back to the partnership agreement and tapped a specific clause on page 31. "Your equity buyout formula is based on a rolling 3-year average of client-attributed revenue. But look at Section 14.6. I looked. Section 14.6 governed client transitions during partner departures. It required a formal transition protocol including partner-to-partner client meetings and written client consent to reassignment, none of which had happened." Daniel continued, "By notifying clients unilaterally under firm letterhead before completing the required transition protocol, they've technically violated the procedural terms of your own partnership agreement, which means the standard buyout formula doesn't automatically apply. The clients aren't legally transferred until the protocol is completed." I sat back in my chair slowly. Daniel wasn't finished. "David, this also means that any client who chooses to follow you rather than remain with the firm is not a violation of your non-competition covenant, because the firm broke protocol first." I asked him what that meant in practical terms. Daniel exhaled through his nose. "It means if Robert Halberstam wants to move his business to a firm you join or start, he can. Same with Trentwood. Same with any client who received that email." I sat with that for a moment. Then I asked the question I needed to ask. "Daniel, I'm not trying to destroy the firm." He nodded slowly. "I know you're not, but David, you also need to understand something. You didn't create this situation. They did. And your job right now is to protect your family, your reputation, and the 20 years of work you put into those relationships, not to protect people who spent the last month planning your removal in secret." At 9:52 a.m., we joined Robert's conference call from my dining room. 6 clients on the line. Harrison Trent, Robert Halberstam, Margaret Yun, a representative from the Bellamy family office and both regional bank general counsels. I introduced Daniel as my counsel and explained clearly that I could not discuss ongoing firm matters directly, but that Daniel could speak to any procedural questions the group had. Robert took over from there. He walked through what each of them had received Friday afternoon, the timing, the wording, and their collective concern that a partner-level transition of this magnitude had been announced without any prior client consultation. Then Harrison Trent said one sentence that shifted the entire conversation. "I want to know what our options are if we choose to leave together." Daniel opened his portfolio and began to speak. Daniel spoke for 11 minutes without interruption. He explained the procedural violation in language that was careful, precise, and never once crossed into advocacy. He walked the clients through their rights under standard engagement letters, the specific language most law firms used regarding client consent to representation transfers, and the general principle that clients always retain the right to choose their own counsel regardless of internal firm decisions. He never told them what to do. He only told them what they could do. That distinction mattered because everyone on the call was sophisticated enough to know the difference between advice and permission. When Daniel finished, there was a long silence. Then Margaret Yun spoke. "I've been with Kellerman for 9 years because David handled our restructuring in 2016. I don't know Alina Vale. I have no reason to trust her with our next acquisition cycle." Nobody disagreed. Harrison Trent asked the practical question. "David, if we were to move our engagements, where would we move them to?" I looked at Daniel. Daniel looked back at me. We had discussed this exact question at the dining room table 40 minutes earlier and had agreed I would not answer it during this call. I told Harrison honestly that I had not yet made any decisions about my next professional step and that I would not be making those decisions during an active client conference. Harrison accepted that answer without pushing. Robert Halberstam followed up. "David, when will you have clarity?" I told him I expected to have a clearer picture by Wednesday. Robert said, "We'll wait until Wednesday." The others agreed. The call ended at 10:38 a.m. 6 of my largest client relationships had just informally agreed to pause any transition decisions for 4 days while I figured out my next move. After the call ended, Daniel closed his portfolio slowly. "David, do you understand what just happened?" I nodded. He continued anyway. "Those 6 clients represent, based on the numbers you showed me, somewhere between 38 and 42% of your firm's active revenue, and they just collectively decided to withhold representation decisions until you tell them where you're going." I sat quietly for a moment. Then I asked the question I had been avoiding since Friday afternoon. "Daniel, what do you think I should do?" He didn't answer immediately. He poured himself another cup of coffee from his gas station thermos. Then he said, "David, I think you have 3 options. You can negotiate an aggressive exit package with Kellerman using the procedural violation as leverage. You can join an established firm that would kill to have a book of business this size walking through their door. Or you can start your own practice." I stared at him. Start my own practice. At 51 years old. The thought had genuinely not occurred to me over the previous 18 hours because my entire professional identity had been built inside Kellerman and Associates. But Daniel wasn't finished. "David, you have infrastructure most solo partners don't have when they leave big firms. You have 20 years of relationships. You have a documented track record of complex closings. You have clients who just publicly decline to accept a substitute. You wouldn't be building from zero. You'd be building from consolidation." I asked him about the practical realities. Office space, malpractice insurance, staffing, technology platforms, all the operational scaffolding that a partner-level attorney typically took for granted. Daniel smiled slightly. "David, all of that is solvable in about 6 weeks. What isn't solvable is manufacturing the kind of client trust you already have." Karen was standing in the doorway of the dining room. I hadn't noticed her come in. She looked at me and said, "David, I've listened to the last 20 minutes. Then she looked at Daniel, then back at me, and she said something that made the whole weekend feel like it was finally pointing in a direction. "David, You've spent 20 years building somebody else's firm. Maybe it's time to build your own. I spent Sunday thinking, not in the abstract, thoughtful way people describe in retirement speeches. In the granular, practical way senior attorneys think when they're doing due diligence on themselves. I walked the neighborhood twice. I made 3 lists on a legal pad in my home office. I called my accountant at his home, apologized for the intrusion, and asked him to run some preliminary numbers on what a solo partnership launch would look like based on projected revenue if even half of my current client relationships followed me. He called back in 90 minutes. The numbers were not just workable. They were significantly better than my current partnership distributions had been for the last 3 years. That was the moment I realized something uncomfortable. Kellerman had been quietly reducing my compensation relative to my book of business for a while. I just hadn't noticed because I trusted the formula. And I trusted Marcus. Monday morning arrived with a coldness in the air that felt appropriate. I put on a suit not because I had anywhere formal to be, but because I needed the structure of it. Daniel had returned to Boston Sunday afternoon and was working from his office to prepare a formal response to Kellerman's memorandum. At 8:47 a.m. my phone rang. Marcus Kellerman. I let it go to voicemail. He called again 9 minutes later. Voicemail again. At 9:23 a.m., an email arrived from the managing committee requesting an urgent meeting Monday afternoon to discuss the terms of my transition. Daniel forwarded me a draft response at 9:41. It was 3 sentences long. It informed the committee that all further communications regarding my separation would be directed through his office, and that no additional client communications were to be issued by the firm pending resolution of the procedural concerns his office had identified. He sent it at 10:00 a.m. exactly. The response from Kellerman came within 18 minutes. Marcus called Daniel directly. Daniel let it go to voicemail as well. Then Alina Vale tried to reach me on my personal cell. I didn't answer. By noon, the firm had figured out that the situation had changed and was no longer proceeding on their timeline. At 12:47 p.m., Daniel called me from his office. David, they've requested a meeting for Wednesday. Their counsel will be present. I asked who they had retained. Daniel told me. Bradford and Sinclair, one of the most aggressive employment defense firms in Connecticut. That told me 2 things. First, the firm was taking this seriously. Second, Marcus was already worried about liability, not just about client retention. Daniel and I agreed to the Wednesday meeting and began preparing our position over the next 48 hours. Tuesday brought something I had not anticipated. At 10:12 a.m., I received a call from a firm I had crossed paths with occasionally over the years. Winslow, Hart & Chen. A well-established mid-sized firm based in New Haven with a strong M&A practice, but a noticeable gap in the technology sector I had spent my career specializing in. The managing partner, Diana Winslow, was on the line personally. She did not pretend she didn't know what was happening. She simply said, "David, I'd like to have a conversation about what your next chapter might look like, whenever you're ready." I told her I appreciated the outreach and would be in touch after Wednesday. 2 hours later, I received a similar call from a firm in Stamford, then another from a boutique in Providence. Word had already moved through the market, not because I had said anything, because clients had. By Tuesday evening, 3 firms had reached out. All of them wanted to discuss the possibility of me joining as a senior partner with substantial equity and full attribution for the book of business I would bring. Daniel called me at 8:00 p.m. and said something that made me pause. "David, you need to decide by tomorrow morning what you actually want, because after Wednesday's meeting, the offers are going to change." I didn't sleep much Tuesday night. Corinne and I sat in the living room until almost midnight going through the options one at a time. Winslow, Hart & Chen offered stability, an established platform, and immediate integration into an existing partnership structure. The Stamford firm offered aggressive equity terms and access to a larger regional client base. The Providence boutique offered something more interesting, a co-managing partner position with structural authority over the firm's direction. Each option had merit, But something Daniel had said Saturday morning kept coming back to me. You wouldn't be building from zero. You'd be building from consolidation. Around 11:30 p.m., Corinne finally said what she had been thinking all evening. David, every time you talk about joining another firm, your voice gets smaller. Every time you talk about starting your own, it doesn't. I sat with that for a long time. Wednesday morning, I put on the same suit I had worn Friday, not out of superstition, out of symmetry. Daniel met me in the lobby of a downtown office building at 9:45 a.m. The meeting was scheduled for 10:00 a.m. at Bradford and Sinclair's conference facility. Neutral ground. That detail alone told me the firm was already treating this as a legal matter rather than an internal partnership discussion. We rode the elevator up in silence. When the doors opened, we were led to a conference room I had never been in before. Marcus Kellerman was already seated. Alina Vale was beside him. Two attorneys from Bradford and Sinclair sat across from where Daniel and I were positioned. Nobody stood when I entered. That was fine. I wasn't there for courtesies. The lead attorney from Bradford and Sinclair opened with a prepared statement. He described the firm's position that my transition to of counsel status was a legitimate exercise of the managing committee's authority under the partnership agreement, that all client communications had been made in good faith, and that Kellerman and Associates was prepared to offer a standard separation package consistent with market norms. Daniel let him finish. Then Daniel opened his portfolio, removed 3 documents, and slid them across the table one at a time. The first was our formal position paper detailing the procedural violation under Section 14.6. The second was a summary of the 6 clients who had formally communicated their intent to reevaluate representation pending resolution of the transition. The third was a preliminary revenue attribution analysis, showing that those 6 clients represented approximately 40% of the firm's active engagements. The room went quiet. The lead attorney read the documents carefully. Marcus read them faster and less carefully. Alina stared at the third document longer than the other 2. Then the lead attorney set the papers down and said, "We'll need to caucus." Daniel nodded once. Marcus, Alina, and the 2 attorneys left the conference room. Daniel and I sat alone for 23 minutes. I didn't speak. Daniel didn't either. We had said everything that needed to be said before we walked in the door. When the group returned, the tone had shifted noticeably. The lead attorney sat down and said, "We'd like to discuss a revised separation structure." Daniel simply said, "Please proceed." What followed was a negotiation I had not expected. The firm offered a substantially enhanced buyout package. They offered to release me from the standard non-competition covenant entirely. They offered to issue a joint communication to the client list clarifying that any client was free to choose their preferred representation without prejudice. And they offered a formal letter acknowledging that the initial communication had been premature. Daniel listened to all of it, then said, "We appreciate the revisions. We'll need 48 hours to review." Marcus finally spoke for the first time in the meeting. "David, I hope we can resolve this professionally." I looked at him steadily and said, "Marcus, you should have thought about that Friday afternoon." Then I stood up and walked out. Daniel and I had lunch at a diner 3 blocks from Bradford and Sinclair's offices. We didn't discuss the meeting for the first 10 minutes. We just ordered food and drank coffee and let the adrenaline settle. Then Daniel said, "David, you know what happened in that room, right?" I nodded. "They realized they miscalculated." Daniel shook his head slightly. "It's more than that. They realized they can't survive the miscalculation. If 40% of their revenue walks out the door, they're not the firm they were last week. They're something significantly smaller." I stirred my coffee. "So what do you recommend?" Daniel thought for a moment. "The enhanced package is generous. Take it. Release yourself from every restriction they're willing to remove. Then make your own decision about what comes next without them having any claim on the outcome." I told him I agreed. Then I told him something else. "Daniel, I've decided. I'm starting my own firm." He didn't look surprised. He just smiled slightly and said, "I know. You decided somewhere around Sunday afternoon. You just needed the meeting today to prove to yourself it was the right decision." He was right. The meeting had confirmed something I had been circling since Corinne's comment Saturday morning. I had spent 20 years protecting a firm that had never really been mine. Every one of those client relationships had been built on my judgment, my responsiveness, my willingness to be reachable during crises. The Kellerman brand had been the letterhead, but the trust had always been personal. And now I finally understood what that meant in practical terms. We spent Thursday and Friday finalizing the separation agreement. Daniel negotiated aggressively but without hostility. By Friday afternoon, exactly 1 week after the boardroom meeting, I signed the final paperwork. The buyout was substantial. The non-competition covenant was gone. The joint client communication was drafted, reviewed, and scheduled to go out the following Monday. And I was, for the first time in 20 years, no longer a partner at Kellerman and Associates. I drove home Friday evening feeling something I had not expected. Not sadness, not even relief exactly. Something more like clarity. The kind of clarity that only arrives after you've stopped negotiating with your own doubts. Over the following 6 weeks, I built Prescott and Partners from the ground up. I leased office space in a smaller building in West Hartford, closer to home and far from the downtown Hartford corridor where Kellerman operated. I hired 2 associates who had privately reached out to me during the transition, both of whom had been passed over for partnership consideration at Kellerman. In favor of candidates the managing committee found more culturally aligned. I retained a small operations team, contracted with a technology platform that specialized in mid-market law firm infrastructure, and secured malpractice coverage through a broker Daniel recommended. The scaffolding came together faster than I had expected, largely because I had spent 20 years watching how a firm operated from the inside and knew exactly which decisions mattered and which ones didn't. The client transitions happened one by one, on each client's own timeline. Harrison Trent moved Trentwood Holdings within 3 weeks. Robert Halberstam moved Halberstam Industries the following week. Margaret Yun, the Bellamy family office, and both regional bank general counsels followed within 2 months. By the end of the first quarter, Prescott and Partners had absorbed roughly 70% of the client relationships that had received the original Friday afternoon email. Not because I had solicited them, because they had chosen. Meanwhile, Kellerman and Associates was in visible distress. 2 junior partners resigned within the first 6 weeks. Alina Vale reportedly failed to close 2 of the transactions she had inherited. And Marcus Kellerman, according to one industry contact who called me for coffee, had aged noticeably in a matter of weeks. I did not take satisfaction in any of it, but I also did not look away. 6 months after the Friday afternoon vote, I drove past the Kellerman offices for the first time since leaving. It was a Tuesday morning. I had a breakfast meeting with a new prospective client near downtown, and my route took me past the building without me planning it. The lobby signage still read Kellerman, Prescott, and Vale. They had never removed my name. I found that detail more revealing than anything else. Not out of respect, out of paralysis. Removing my name would have required a formal partnership vote, and formal partnership votes had become dangerous inside that firm. So they had left it up. A quiet monument to a decision they had never fully processed. I kept driving. The industry had already made its own assessment. 3 of the deals Kellerman had inherited from my book of business had collapsed during due diligence. 2 because the firm's remaining team had missed operational contingencies I would have caught in the first review. And 1 because Alina Vale had reportedly clashed with opposing counsel in a way that made the client uncomfortable enough to withdraw. 2 more clients had quietly moved to competitors after receiving what they described as inconsistent responsiveness during active engagements. Marcus had reportedly attempted to bring in a lateral partner from a New York firm to stabilize the client relationships, but the lateral had declined the offer after 2 weeks of due diligence. Word travels fast in mid-market M&A. Nobody wanted to inherit a book of business that had already voted with its feet. Prescott and Partners, meanwhile, had grown faster than my initial projections. By month 4, I had brought on a 3rd associate. By month 6, We had signed our first engagement with a new client I had never worked with at Kellerman, a specialty manufacturer in Rhode Island who had asked around and been referred to us by Harrison Trent. That referral told me something important. My old clients had not just moved their business. They had started building the practice for me by mentioning my name in rooms I would never enter. That was the reward for 20 years of doing the work correctly. It just took getting pushed out for me to see it clearly. Corinne and I took a long weekend in Maine at the end of the 6th month. We stayed at a small inn on the coast, ate lobster on a deck overlooking the water, and talked about almost nothing that involved the firm. On the second night, she asked me if I ever regretted the 20 years I had spent at Kellerman. I thought about it for a while before answering. I told her no. Those 20 years were not wasted. They were the foundation. Without them, I would not have had the relationships, the reputation, the operational instincts, or the client trust to build what I was building now. The mistake was not staying too long. The mistake was assuming that loyalty inside an institution would be reciprocated by the institution itself. Institutions do not have loyalty, only people do, and I had spent 20 years confusing the two. On the drive home from Maine, I thought about Marcus one more time, not with anger, not even with disappointment, with something closer to recognition, because I finally understood what he had actually done that Friday afternoon. He had not just voted me out of the firm. He had involuntarily set me free from a partnership that had been slowly consuming my leverage for years, and in doing so, he had handed me the last thing I would have ever asked for, and the exact thing I needed most. A clean start built on 20 years of foundation. If you have ever been pushed out of something you helped build, I hope this story reminded you that the value you created does not disappear when they close the door behind you. It walks out with you. If this story resonated with you, please like, share, and subscribe for more stories like this one. Peace.